This video was sponsored by Ecosia. I have a confession to make. As a recovering fan of Windows Phone, I used to think that live tiles were the absolute best. In fact, just like every other Windows Phone fan that I knew, I was convinced that they were one of the core things that made the platform that I loved special and worth using. After all, live tiles so elegantly combined app icons, widgets, and notifications all into one cohesive and iconic system, pun very much intended, which I think even today looks kind of elegant and timeless in a way. Instead of a static app grid that at best give you a red badge to tell you how many emails you had that you'll never catch up on anyway, live tiles brought real information right to the surface. Microsoft was so confident in the system that in earlier versions of Windows Phone they didn't even have a proper notification center, instead relying on the tiles themselves to let the user know if they had to check something. Live tiles were, in my opinion, Microsoft's most ambitious attempt to reinvent the start screen, but they never really took off. And now, looking back with my rose-tinted glasses mostly gone, I realize that they might have been doomed from the start. A quick update before we start. I have a Patreon now. It is completely optional, but a couple of viewers asked me for it, so if you want to support the channel like that, it is patreon.com/TechAltar. Live tiles started off on Windows Phone in 2010, and back then they were pretty simple. The background was always black, the tiles themselves had a default single solid color, unless they displayed something specific, and they came in just two sizes, normal and wide. Over time, the system then expanded. With Windows 8, the tiles in the backgrounds became much more colorful. We got our third, smaller tile size, as well as folders to better group our tiles in, and also the ability to replace solid colors with photos. And even more interesting perhaps were concepts that Microsoft Research teased that showed live tiles not as simple information boards but as interactive widgets for the first time, letting you scroll and tap on them to control your apps without ever having to open them. This all seemed very cool to me back then, but it also clearly failed to catch on. Microsoft stopped updating live tiles in 2017, a whole 7 years ago, with none of the advanced features ever being added. On the desktop, they were more or less fully replaced by just static icons and to some degree widgets, just like on any other OS, while on the phones that I have, very few of the live tiles still properly work anymore either. Apple and Google also never showed any interest in copying the system, despite the two having no trouble copying other design choices from each other all the time, and the only people keeping this idea alive are basically indie developers who've built apps like Live Tiles Anywhere and Launcher 10, which lets you basically emulate this system on Windows and Android respectively. There's also the Ratio Launcher that I've covered on my channel in the past before that has used a lot of the same core ideas, like highlighting information at a glance without having to pull out your apps, just with a different design. But either way, none of these indie projects ever got past maybe 1 million active users or so, and by and large we can say that the market has rejected live tiles quite resoundingly. Now, among Windows Phone fans, the pervasive opinion is that live tiles have failed because Microsoft did a poor job with them, which I think is at least partially true. After all, even many key Microsoft apps like Skype had broken live tiles half the time. The Windows 10 start menu was filled by Microsoft with live tiles that were clearly just animated ads rather than showing you something actually useful. And the company, of course, never built out any of their advanced interactive concepts either. But while all of that might be true, the fact that every major company has walked away from this idea and nobody else has picked it up since means that there probably are more fundamental problems with this idea. And I can think of 3 distinct ones: user experience, form factors, and horizontal integration. Starting with the user experience, the fact that live tiles are supposed to do the job of icons, widgets, and notifications all in one meant that almost by definition, they weren't as good at doing either as dedicated elements. An icon, for example, should let users quickly identify the right app from a list using a distinct color, a shape, and a position. But live tiles half the time showed some information instead of an easy to recognize logo, and most of them didn't have a distinct color either to avoid making a busy screen look even busier. Even the position of the tiles wasn't static, as the whole screen was designed to slide, so you couldn't fully rely on muscle memory either. In other words, the more you used live tiles as rich, animated information boards, the harder it became to actually find your apps on your home screen. Now, of course, if you're a person who's invested enough into their phone to call yourself a Windows Phone fan, then you probably just memorize the position of all your apps or something like that. But even for me, a pretty dedicated Windows Phone user, I still remember the feeling of having to stumble around for like a second or two to find an app that I don't use that often. And whenever I talk to my normie friends who used Windows Phone from back then as well, they said the same. So of course you could fix this and make apps easier to recognize by turning a bunch of your live tiles off just to show the icons instead. But as soon as you didn't have all your live tiles on, your home screen, of course, no longer worked as a fully sufficient notification system. Unsurprisingly, Microsoft added a dedicated notification center with Windows Phone 8.1, just like the ones we were used to on iOS and Android, which was nice, I guess. But that then kind of made the notification aspect of live tiles somewhat redundant. Okay, so they're not the best as icons, they're not the best as notifications. How about as widgets? Well, I'm afraid it's more of the same. Unlike widgets on Android and iOS, which can offer interactivity and flexibility, live tiles cannot, at least not without accepting major sacrifices. Sure, this demo that we've seen a couple of times already looks great, but in reality, the majority of the time you'd want to tap a tile just to open the app. After all, it's an icon first and foremost. Making your tiles interactive would now mean that you have to memorize which part of which tile you have to click to open the app, and it would also make scrolling a nightmare, as you would end up with scrolling tiles inside a scrolling feed. And if you've ever used, a scrolling text box inside a scrolling website, for example, you know how frustrating that can be. And now imagine that, but as your home screen. In the demos, they fixed this by the user first having to tap an extra button to kind of activate the live tile, but then why not just open the actual app? After all, it would take the exact same amount of taps, which is 1. Now, can a designer who's smarter than me solve a bunch of these problems? Perhaps, but the point is that if you combine 3 elements into one, you're gonna have a whole lot of compromises. Most users I know ended up with a screen that mostly consisted of static icons and then had a few live tiles active for, the calendar or the weather. But then guess what? You could achieve the exact same thing on Android or iOS with widgets, which are fully optional for people who don't want them at all. And that is the direction that Microsoft seems to be going for on the desktop as well, where they have just added widgets to the start menu and preview builds. Okay, so that is the kind of core user experience problem, but problem number 2, in my opinion, comes down to form factors. See, live tiles made the most sense on a phone and perhaps a tablet, where you were dropped on your start screen as soon as you unlocked the device, and where being greeted by some helpful information was probably nice. They made a bit less sense on the Xbox, where games hardly had any essential updates they had to communicate with you right on your start screen, and then they made the least sense on a desktop, where the start menu was hidden at 99.9% of the time, and where, when it was opened, it was to quickly launch an app that you probably typed out on your keyboard anyway. Windows Central said that they saw internal documentation suggesting that people weren't really using live tiles in the start menu on the desktop in general, and instead just basically pinned everything to the taskbar. Now, as long as Microsoft pushed all 4 device categories, I do think that live tiles helped to tie this ecosystem together, but once Windows Phone was abandoned and Microsoft's tablet efforts failed to really go mainstream, the live tiles started to make less and less sense. Okay, and the third thing that killed this whole endeavor, at least in my opinion, is what I will call horizontal integration. See, instead of developing a completely native app from scratch for every single platform, developers are incentivized to reuse their code and application logic across as many platforms as possible. Microsoft's big pitch, starting with Windows 8, but especially with Windows 10, was what I will call vertically integrated app development. You could build a single app and have that run with slight modifications across all device categories, at least within the Microsoft ecosystem. The same app running on Windows Phone, a Windows tablet, a Windows PC, the Xbox, etc. Modern Microsoft app frameworks at the time, such as UWP, heavily promoted this idea, and live tiles were, at least initially, tied to these frameworks. So if developers had jumped on this sort of vertically integrated app development model like Microsoft had hoped, then I think we would have seen quite a lot of Microsoft features, for example, live tiles coming to a lot of apps. After all, you build an app once and it runs on 2, 3, 4 device categories, and so maybe that would have been worth it. But that is not what happened. Developers overwhelmingly chose horizontal integration, where they shared code and also just the general layout and feature set across software platforms, but per device type. This is why an Android app rarely feels radically different from its iOS counterpart, or why for desktops, most modern apps are built either as basically just websites or as something like Electron apps that can run with practically no changes on all major desktop platforms. Many of these cross-platform solutions, at least initially, didn't support platform-exclusive features like live tiles at all. And even when they did, the whole point for developers was to have as much of a shared codebase across platforms as possible, and so platform-specific features like live tiles were simply an afterthought at best. And so in the end, I think a combination of horizontal integration, the abandoning of phones and tablets, and also the other core UX problems are what made this fail kind of inevitable. Okay, and to finish up, no matter what operating system you ended up on, being Android or iOS or some desktop platform, I have a recommendation for you, and it is to change your default search engine over to Ecosia. Ecosia is a search engine that plants trees with no extra effort required from you. You just search as usual. Ecosia serves you results from a combination of Google and Bing in the background, so you get great results, and then if you click on an ad, the company takes 100% of their profits from that and spends it on environmental projects like planting trees. They have to date planted over 200 million trees across 35 countries and also make sure that they generate twice as much electricity with solar panels as they use to power their services. I've been using Ecosia myself for a few years now, and I've noticed that the results have gotten really good lately with the addition of Google search results, and also as they have added a lot of interactive widgets for currency conversions, information boxes, etc. to make your queries more convenient. As a non-profit from Berlin, Ecosia is not in the business of snooping on you, so they don't track you across platforms. And if you don't want personalized search results, you can use them without having to accept things like cookies. Ecosia is completely transparent about their finances with detailed monthly reports, as well as about how exactly they plant and monitor their trees to ensure a positive impact instead of some greenwashed nonsense. The founder has even signed a legally binding document to make sure that the company can never be sold and no profits can ever be taken out of it as dividends either. Now that is about as trustworthy as one can get, and by the way, it also just got easier to set Ecosia as your default search engine. Especially in the European Union, Apple on iOS and also Google in a bunch of places have been forced to allow you to change your defaults, but in most other places you can usually set Ecosia up on both desktop and mobile as well. I have a magic link in ecosia.co/TechAltar, and mind you, that is a .co address, not a .com one, but either way, this automatically opens the correct App Store or add-on page based on what device and browser you're opening it from. So go to ecosia.co/TechAltar, that is also linked down in the description. Set Ecosia as your default search engine on all your platforms, and I'll see you in the next video.